February of 2018, I was teaching outside Plattsburgh, upstate New York. Winter up there isn't a season, it's a condition you live under. That day, I stayed late at school, putting together a small packet for one of my kids who'd been struggling. Just something to let him know someone noticed. When I finally walked out, the wind had teeth. Snow was already moving sideways under the parking lot lights, thin at first. I brushed off my car, let it warm, checked the weather app. Warning box, flashing. I told myself what I always told myself. You're prepared. You've driven in worse. I had a blanket, a scraper, a charger. I wasn't reckless. I was just trying to get home. The first stretch of road was manageable. Then the snow thickened in layers, visibility shrinking by the minute. 50 yards became 20. The world narrowed to my headlights and nothing else. I slowed, both hands tight on the wheel, repeating calm instructions in my head like I was talking to a student. Then the road disappeared under my tires. Not a crash, just a slide. The front end drifted right and settled into a shallow ditch with a soft, final give. Snow puffed up around the bumper. I sat there with the engine running, wipers squealing, listening to the wind scrape snow across the car. Okay, I said out loud, because silence makes everything worse. I tried backing out. The tires spun uselessly. Rocking it only dug me in deeper. My phone showed one bar that flickered like it might give up any second. I called my brother, straight to voicemail, texted him my location and waited for it to send. I tried 911. The call dropped. That's when the lights appeared. Big rotating orange lights blurred by snow. The low rumble of a snowplow eased up behind me, blocking some of the wind. Relief hit me before logic did. The driver climbed down, boots crunching, reflective jacket bright even through the storm. He looked normal, mid-30s maybe, solid, familiar in the way utility workers always are. You all right? He asked through my cracked window. Yes, I'm stuck. He nodded. Happens, storm's coming up hard. I was trying to get home. Come sit in the cab, he said, already turning toward his truck. Warm up. I'll see what I can do. Something in me hesitated. I'm okay in here, I said. I can. Policy, he interrupted with a light laugh. Can't have you freezing out here. Liability. That word did it. Policy. Official. Final. I grabbed my phone and purse and stepped into the snow. The cold bit instantly. Heat rolled out of the plow cab when he opened the door, thick and comforting. I climbed in. The heater blasted my face. For a moment, I let myself relax. Then he climbed in and shut the door. Click. Click. The locks. He didn't look at me when he did it. Where are you headed? He asked. Home. Live alone? I blinked. I'm married. He looked at my hand like he expected proof. Husband waiting? Yes. What do you do? I teach. Elementary. He smiled at that, slow. That's nice. I pulled out my phone and started typing a message to my brother anyway. Something felt wrong in a way I couldn't yet name. Don't waste your battery, he said, noticing immediately. It's fine, I replied, keeping my voice even. His hand drifted toward mine, casual, like he was going to point at something. I pulled my phone back. You nervous? He asked. I want to get home. Storms make people jumpy, he said. Makes you feel trapped. The way he said trapped landed wrong. My eyes dropped to the dashboard, searching for something grounding. That's when I saw the air horn button, big, obvious, within reach. I shifted slightly, calm on the outside. I work with kids, I said. They test limits all day. He watched me now. If you don't unlock the door, I continued, I'm going to hold that air horn down until someone comes. And someone will. A plow horn in a whiteout isn't subtle. For the first time, his expression changed. You're dramatic, he said. I'm alive. Another beat. Then, annoyed, he unlocked the doors. I didn't rush. I thanked him like the interaction was over, climbed down into the snow, and moved away from the cab. He dropped the plow blade and drove off without helping, lights swallowed almost immediately by white. I waited, shaking now, not from the cold, but from understanding what almost happened. When 911 finally connected, I told them I felt unsafe. I didn't say more than that. What had he technically done? Locked doors, asked questions, reached. Help came later. A real tow truck. A normal man who stayed by his vehicle and spoke through my window. When I got home, I stood in my entryway, listening to the quiet. People ask why I got in the plow. Because it looked like help. Because it had lights and a uniform and the word policy. Because Winter trains you to accept help quickly. But he didn't want to help. He wanted me inside something I couldn't leave. I was a senior at CSU in Fort Collins in January of 2021, which meant I was tired in a quiet, constant way. Not dramatic exhaustion, just the kind that makes your brain feel a half step behind your body. That night, I closed at my part-time job. Nothing unusual. People lingering longer than they should because snow somehow makes everyone indecisive. By the time I clocked out, the storm had already settled in for real. Big flakes, heavy and clean. The kind that don't drift so much as fall straight down and erase things as they go. I drove home slow. When I turned into my apartment complex, it looked unreal. Streetlights glowing through the snow, cars buried to their windows. Everything muted and still. Snow has a way of making the world feel empty, even when you know it isn't. I parked near Building C, pulled my hat down, zipped my coat to my chin, and stepped out. My boots crunched loudly on the fresh snow. I put my headphones in, but kept the volume low. Winter hides sounds. I've always known that. The walk to my building wasn't long, maybe a minute. I remember thinking about getting inside, peeling off wet layers, letting my brain shut off, but then I noticed footprints. At first I assumed they were mine from earlier, but they weren't. They were too crisp, too close. A second set, just off to the side of mine. Same direction, not crossing. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. People live here, people come home, it's snowing, but the longer I walked, the more wrong it felt. I slowed down, my gut tightened up, that internal click that tells you to pay attention. I stayed still for a second, then turned. Halfway down the path, near the parked cars, a man stood under the lights. Hood up, hands in his pockets, face hidden by shadow and falling snow. Not moving. He didn't wave, didn't apologize, didn't pretend he was doing something else. He just stood there like he belonged. I turned back around and kept walking. Faster now. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the cold biting through my gloves. Behind me, crunch, crunch. When I turned, he was closer. Not by much, just enough to notice. Enough to confirm it wasn't my imagination. I pulled my phone out and unlocked it, holding it like a shield. I pretended to scroll, then lifted it to my ear and said loud, "Yeah, I'm right by Building C. See you in a second." I listened. The footsteps behind me changed, not into running, just faster, closing the gap. That's when I saw my stairwell door ahead. Glass panel, metal frame, keypad lock that always took 2 tries. I walked faster. My hands were shaking now, snow sliding down my sleeves as I fumbled for the fob. The lock didn't register the first time. I tried again. It clicked. I yanked the door open and slipped inside, reaching back to shove it shut. The closer moved too slowly, like it didn't understand urgency. A second later, he hit it. The glass rattled in the frame, hard enough that I flinched back, full force pounding, over and over, angry in a way that felt personal. I ran up the stairs, nearly slipping, and ducked into the hallway. I dropped to the floor, back against the wall, phone clutched to my chest like it might disappear. I called campus security out of habit. Wrong move. They told me to call 911. So I did. While I was on the phone, I crawled to the hallway window and peeked out, staying low. The stairwell light was still on. The door was still there. He wasn't. Gone. The snow was fresh enough that every step showed, but I couldn't find a clean trail that made sense. Just drifts, shadows, places where wind had already softened the surface. It felt like the storm had swallowed him on purpose. The officer arrived a few minutes later. He walked the path, shined his flashlight, asked what the man looked like. I hated that I couldn't give him much. Hood, dark clothes, average build. The most unsettling part wasn't his appearance, it was how deliberate he'd been. How he stayed far enough away to deny intent, then closed in the moment I pretended I wasn't alone. They said they'd patrol the area. I went inside, locked my door, and stood in my kitchen staring out at the snow like it had personally turned on me. For weeks after, I changed everything. Different parking spots, different routes, no headphones. Phone already unlocked in my hand. I'd wait in my car until I saw someone else heading inside first, like I needed proof it was safe to exist. And the worst part was the doubt. The part of me that kept asking if I'd overreacted, if I'd turned a normal situation into something darker because snow makes everything feel eerie. Then I'd remember the sound of that door shaking under his fists. Nobody pounds on a door like that to ask for directions. I like things that make sense. That's why what happened in Rapid City in December of 2020 still doesn't sit right with me. That night, the weather was bad enough that my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Wind warnings, whiteout alerts, the kind of storm where the apps start using words like dangerous instead of inconvenient. I was home alone, which was fine by me. Blizzard nights are good excuses to stay in and not feel guilty about it. I had Netflix on, volume low. The wind kept hitting the siding in uneven bursts, sometimes hard enough to rattle the windows. The power flickered once, not out, just enough to make the lights blink and the router reset. I got up automatically and checked the locks. Front door, back door, deadbolt, chain. It wasn't fear yet. I went back to the couch. About an hour later, I heard a knock. Not a random noise. Not wind. Not something falling. 3 knocks. A pause. 2 more. It stood out immediately because storms don't knock like that. I muted the TV and listened. The wind howled, snow hissed against the windows, and then it happened again. Same pattern. Calm. I moved to the front window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to look out without putting myself on display. The porch light was on, snow blowing sideways through it, and standing on my porch was a woman. She looked young, mid-20s maybe, hood up, hair plastered to her face, shoulders tight like she was freezing. She noticed the movement behind the curtain and stepped closer to the door. "Please," she said, "can you let me in? My car broke down." I stayed behind the door and spoke through it. "Are you okay? Where's your car?" "Down the street," she said. "It won't start. I just need to warm up." That should have been simple, but something felt off immediately. I looked past her shoulder, trying to see the road. The street was empty. Snow smooth and untouched. No hazard lights, no dark shape of a vehicle, no tire marks. "Okay," I said. "I'll call someone. Police or a tow truck." "No," she said quickly. "No police, just let me inside." That response stuck. If you're stranded in a blizzard, you don't argue about help. You don't refuse it. I asked what kind of car she had. She didn't answer. She just repeated, "Please, just let me inside." I leaned closer to the peephole and looked down at the porch. Her boots were wet. I stepped back from the door. "I can't let you in," I said, "but I'll call for help." And then her talking stopped. Instantly. She didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't get angry. She smiled. Her teeth were chattering, clicking faintly, but her eyes stayed locked on the door. She wasn't frantic or confused, she was focused. That's when I moved away from the entryway and grabbed my phone. I called 911 and stuck to the facts. Woman on my porch claims her car broke down. No car visible. Refusing help, insisting I open the door. The dispatcher told me officers were on the way, though response might be slow because of the storm. She told me to stay away from doors and windows and keep the line open. I killed the living room lights and stood in the hallway where I could still look toward the front without being obvious. Minutes passed. The woman stayed exactly where she was. She didn't pace, didn't stomp her feet, didn't turn sideways to block the wind. She just stood there, shoulders hunched, smiling at the door. I kept thinking, if she's freezing, why isn't she moving? Then my porch camera sent a motion alert. I opened the feed on my phone. The image was grainy but clear enough. She was right up against the door now, close enough that her breath fogged the lens. And she wasn't looking into the camera. She was looking slightly to the side, toward where I was standing inside, like she knew. I whispered to the dispatcher that she hadn't left, that she'd moved closer. The dispatcher told me officers were almost there. Headlights finally cut through the curtains, followed by red and blue flashes washing across my ceiling. On the camera feed, the woman was there. Then she wasn't. 1 second she filled the frame. The next, the porch was empty, snow blowing through the light like nothing had ever stood there. The dispatcher told me to stay put. Moments later, a different knock came. Short, firm. Police. I made them say my name before opening the door. When I finally did, cold air rushed in like it had been waiting. They checked the porch, the steps, the street. One officer crouched near the base of the stairs, shining his flashlight over the snow. "There aren't any tracks," he said. That didn't calm me. It confirmed what I already knew. They walked around the house. Flashlights moved through the yard, the storm swallowing their voices. Then one of them called out from behind the house. I went to the back window. My back windows were covered in smeared handprints. Not neat ones. Full palms, fingers dragged down the glass, like someone had pressed against the glass and moved, trying to figure out where I was inside. There were no tracks in the yard beneath them. The officers took photos, asked questions I didn't have answers to, promised extra patrols. Eventually, they left. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with every light on, listening to the wind, replaying her smile, and the way she stopped talking once I said no. For weeks after, I checked my locks twice. I adjusted the porch camera to cover more of the yard. Every knock, even normal ones, made my stomach tighten. Storms don't bother me the same way anymore, because that night taught me something I don't like thinking about. She didn't need shelter. She needed me to open something. After my husband died, winter felt longer. Not colder, just heavier. I'd wake up, make coffee, stare out the kitchen window, and measure my day in inches of snowfall. Snow is just work when you live alone. People who haven't had to do it every time don't really get that. They talk about how quiet it is, how pretty everything looks covered in white. But when there's no one to trade mornings with, no one to say, "I'll handle it today," snow isn't peaceful. It's an obligation that shows up whether you're ready or not. Boots by the door, old coat, gloves that were worn thin but familiar, shovel. My driveway wasn't big. 1 car wide, just long enough to reach the street. I cleared it myself because I could, and because it felt important to prove that I still could. I was a nurse most of my life. Retired, yes, but I didn't like feeling helpless in my own home. So in February of 2018, my mornings followed a rhythm. Coffee, shovel, scrape down to the pavement, push snow to the sides, make a clean path. That morning was no different. I finished around 7, got it looking decent, and drove into town for groceries and a prescription refill. The sky stayed gray, the kind that never quite decides if it's done snowing. I came home late afternoon, pulled into my driveway, and stopped so suddenly I stalled the car. For a second, I thought I'd turned into the wrong house. The driveway was untouched, perfect, smooth from edge to edge, like someone had carefully reset it. No sign I'd been there that morning at all. I sat in the car staring. Wind doesn't do that. I stepped out, walked up the side of the driveway, and crouched to touch the surface. It wasn't powdery. It had a pressed, even crust, like it had been smoothed deliberately. I checked the weather on my phone. No new snowfall, no strong gusts since midday. I told myself maybe I remembered wrong. Maybe I hadn't finished as well as I thought. That's what you say when you don't want to name something unsettling yet. The next morning, it was the same. I stood there with my shovel in hand, looking at a driveway that didn't look like it needed shoveling at all. This time, I paid attention. I cleared it again, slower, more careful. And when I finished, I did something that felt childish but necessary. I poured a straight line of salt near the garage and made a deliberate zigzag pattern with my boots across the driveway. Something unmistakable. If it was just weather, the marks would still be there. That evening, when I came home, the driveway was perfect again. No salt line, no boot prints, not even a smear. Just smooth snow, like someone had erased me. That was when irritation turned into something tighter and quieter. The feeling you get when a patient's vitals look fine, but your instincts won't let you relax. I stood in my kitchen staring out the window, grocery bags still on the counter, and thought, someone is doing this on purpose. I tried to explain it away. Kids. A prank. Someone bored. But there were no footprints, no messy shoveling, no carelessness. Whoever was doing this knew how to leave nothing behind. That night, I slept lightly. Not because I expected something dramatic, but because I kept listening. Snow dulls the world, but it sharpens small sounds. The next day, I went to the hardware store and bought a motion light. I'd put it off for years. My husband used to handle things like that, and admitting I needed to do it myself still felt like reopening something. It took me longer than it should have, but I installed it, aimed it at the driveway. If someone was out there at night, I wanted to know. That evening, I stayed home, made soup, watched the news, tried to act like this was all overblown. Around midnight, I was standing behind the front room curtain when the light snapped on, and someone was already there. That's the part I still struggle to explain. The fact that the light didn't catch someone arriving. It revealed someone standing still at the edge of my driveway, just inside the beam. Tall, broad shoulders, dark coat, hood or hat pulled low. They weren't shoveling, weren't moving. Just facing my house, like they were studying it. They didn't flinch when the light came on, didn't shield their eyes, didn't turn away. They stood there, motionless. I stayed where I was, barely breathing, phone in my hand. I didn't want to make a sound that would tell them exactly where I was inside the house. I dialed 911 quietly and whispered when the dispatcher answered. "There's someone standing in my driveway," I said. "They're not doing anything. They're just there." While I spoke, the figure shifted slightly. Not toward the road, toward the side yard, toward the trees behind my house. Then they walked away. No hurry, no reaction, just a calm walk into the darkness beyond the light. When the police arrived, the driveway was empty. 2 officers checked the area with flashlights, breath puffing in the cold. I stayed inside, chain still on the door, talking through the gap. They found boot prints immediately. Large, deep, not mine. The prints crossed the driveway and led straight into the tree line. One officer followed them until they stopped. "There's no trail coming back," he said when he returned. "They just end. No vehicle, no person, no explanation that felt solid." They took a report and offered the usual reassurances. Maybe someone cutting through, maybe a prank, but none of it sat right. After they left, I stood in my kitchen and looked out at the driveway again. Snow is supposed to feel clean, peaceful. All I could see was how easily it hid things. I stopped shoveling at night after that, paid for plowing when I could, installed cameras, left lights on longer than necessary, and sometimes when the light starts to fade in the afternoon, I find myself watching the driveway the way I used to watch a patient's monitor, waiting for the first sign that something isn't right. I thought snow meant quiet. Turns out, It's also a clean slate for someone who wants to keep coming back. I was 19, and it was my first winter working in Gatlinburg. People picture lodge jobs as cozy: fireplaces, tourists in sweaters, hot chocolate behind the desk. That wasn't my reality. I was seasonal. That meant late shifts, basic duties, and being trusted, mostly because I was cheap and didn't complain. The lodge sat right up against the woods. In daylight, the tree line looked harmless: tall pines, a slope that dropped off gently, hiking trails somewhere past the first row of trees. At night, especially during winter, it felt like the building ended and the world just stopped. That December night in 2018, a snowstorm had rolled in hard. Not picturesque snow, the kind that comes sideways and makes the dark feel thicker. Wind slammed into the siding, and every now and then the whole lodge creaked like the walls were moving. I was on the late shift. I was the guy making sure doors were locked, trash got taken out, and nobody slipped on ice. Everyone else was asleep. The parking lot was empty. The woods behind the lodge were loud with wind, but you couldn't see a single branch move. Around 1 a.m, I did my last trash run. I pulled my jacket tight, stepped outside, and felt the cold hit my face instantly. Snow stung my cheeks. The dumpster sat closer to the tree line than I liked, maybe 30 yards away, close enough that the woods felt like they were looming over the lot. I dumped the trash, shut the lid, and turned back toward the lodge. That's when I heard it. A scream. Not an animal, not coyotes. I grew up in Tennessee. I know the difference. This was raw and human. High, panicked, strained. The kind of sound that makes your body react before your brain does. It came from the woods behind the lodge. Not deep, not far away. My first thought was simple: someone's hurt. My second thought followed right behind it. Why would anyone be back there in this storm? The scream came again, shorter this time, like whoever it was didn't have the breath to keep it going. I took one step toward the trees. Silence. I stood there, listening over the storm. Nothing. I turned halfway back toward the lodge, then toward the woods again. My brain was scrambling for explanations, anything that would let me go inside and forget I'd heard it. Then the screaming started again. I stayed still this time, and it kept going. I took another step forward. Silence. I stopped. The screaming came back. I took a step backward. Still screaming. That's when it clicked that this wasn't random. I tested it like an idiot, like it was some kind of experiment. One step forward, nothing. Stand still, screaming. 2 steps, nothing. Freeze, screaming. It never got closer, never farther away. It was holding the distance. My throat felt dry, and not from the cold. I backed closer to the lodge lights and pulled my phone out with numb fingers. I called my supervisor. He answered groggy and annoyed. I told him there was someone screaming in the woods behind the lodge. He asked if I was sure it wasn't an animal. "I'm sure," I said. While I was talking, the screaming stopped again, even though I hadn't moved. That made something twist tight in my chest. My supervisor said he'd call Mark, the overnight security guy, and told me to stay by the building. A few minutes later, Mark came outside with a flashlight and a thick jacket. My supervisor stayed inside, watching through the glass like he didn't want to commit. I pointed toward the tree line. Right there, but every time I move toward it, it stops. Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "I'm not messing around," I said. He stepped forward, screaming. He stopped. Silence. He took another step. Nothing. He stood still. The screaming came back, sharp and close. Mark didn't smile anymore. He swept the flashlight across the first line of trees, but the beam just caught branches and blowing snow. Nothing moved. "We're not going in there," he said. That was the first smart thing anyone said all night. My supervisor told us to lock the back door and come inside. We called non-emergency. Dispatch said they'd send someone when they could, but Storm calls were stacked. The screaming never came back after that. Or maybe the wind swallowed it. I don't know. What I do know is I didn't step outside again that night. Trash could wait. Salt could wait. For the rest of my shift, I sat at the desk pretending to watch TV on mute, my eyes drifting to the back windows every few seconds. Every gust of wind made me tense like it was a knock. When my shift ended near sunrise, the storm had eased. Snow fell softly. Everything looked harmless, like the night hadn't happened at all. I went back out with Mark in daylight, just along the edge of the woods. That's when I saw it. A single glove nailed to a tree, nailed flat against the trunk, fingers curled stiff with ice. The nail head was clean like someone had taken their time. No blood, no tearing, just pinned there. I looked for tracks. The snow was messy. Old prints, wind drifts, but nothing that made sense. No clear trail leading from the lodge. No clear path heading deeper. Mark stared at the glove for a long time before telling me not to touch it. He took photos, said he'd report it. I drove home afterward and sat in my car longer than usual, listening to the engine cool. My hands were still cold, but it wasn't from the weather. I kept replaying how the screaming worked, how it only existed when I stayed still, how it shut off the second I tried to approach. Like it wanted me close, but never close enough to understand. I still don't know if it wanted help, or if it wanted me alone where nobody could hear me scream back. And every winter since, when I walk near a dark tree line, I notice my pace pick up without thinking, because part of me is still waiting for that sound to start again the moment I stop moving. If tonight proved one thing, it's that isolation makes everything worse. Smash that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next nightmare, and tell me which story hit you hardest. And if you think motels are just places to sleep and move on, click now to watch 4 disturbing motel horror stories. Because some walls are thinner than they look, and some locks mean nothing. Or stay put, another video will roll right after this. Thanks for watching, stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.